Համազգային հայ կրթական եւ մշակութային միությունը եւ Երկիր մեդիան ներկայացնում են.
In 2018, Armenians celebrated the centennial of the First Republic. The reborn Armenian state was now 100 years old. In 1918, the aspiration to build a state was not an end to itself. Rather, it would become the guarantor of our existence and the guarantor of spiritual, political, and economic growth of the homeland. To accomplish this goal, strong ideological pillars had to be created, a spiritual Armenia. That was an issue in which Armenian intellectuals, first and foremost, had much to contribute to, and Armenian writers and their literature would have a special role. What steps were taken to create an Armenian literary elite and a literary environment in Armenia that would lead the people in difficult times? Based on facts and factual analysis, let's briefly discuss this interesting topic which deserves a thorough study.
Prior to Armenia's declaration of independence, the Armenian spiritual and cultural life, including her literature, was progressing outside of Armenia proper. Constantinople and Tbilisi were important Armenian literary centers. Additionally, many Armenian writers lived and created their literary works in major European cities. However, after independence, the issue of assembling all Armenian intellectuals in the fatherland gathered utmost importance. In the Araratian landscape, the nucleation and development of the Armenian spiritual and cultural life was essential to the birth of spiritual Armenia and a strong fatherland, one that the individual would believe in and becomes attached to spiritually and mentally, something without which the foundations of the Armenian state would not be stable then as well as today.
Regardless of how complex and confusing the times were, recognition of the importance of creating a spiritual Armenia and taking steps to achieve that goal was gathering momentum. Therefore, in conjunction with efforts to organize the socio-economic life of the country, the learned and patriotic forefathers of the First Armenian Republic were also thinking about the cultural life of the country and the importance of the spiritual and cultural education of the new generation. These efforts were primarily organized by the Ministry of Art and Education, headed by the literary giant and intellectual of the time, Nigol Աղբալyan.
The formation of the educational and cultural life in the First Republic is closely connected with Nigol Աղբալyan's name. Once a member of the Vernadun group and having discerning taste in literature, Աղբալyan was quick to discover new talented writers. He recognized the importance of a literary environment in a newly independent country, and particularly in the capital Yerevan, which at the time was just a poor provincial town. Literature and literary personalities were to be leaders and educators delivering knowledge, ideas, and spirituality. The Western Armenian literature was beheaded as a result of the 1915 genocide. Although certain activities to regroup had already begun in Bolis nevertheless, majority of the Armenian writers were still living in Tbilisi, where an active Armenian literary life existed. Additionally, there were Armenian writers in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and others wandering in Europe. The Bolshevik Revolution and other events that were influencing the Armenian people's destiny had dragged most into the political cyclone and away from active literary life. Vahan Deryan was a prime example of this. Despite being one of the bright personalities of the time, he conducted a passive literary life. From personal and creative aspects, this was also a difficult time for the all-Armenian poet Hovannes Tumanyan, who continued to live in Tbilisi.
Նա շարունակում էր բնակվել Թիֆլիսում.
Հայկական գրականության ու գրական կյանքի գլխավոր կենտրոն շարունակում էր մնալ Թիֆլիսը.
With the exception of Baku, Tiflis basically continued to be the center of the Armenian literature and literary life. To transport this life to Yerevan, inside Armenia proper, proved to be a difficult undertaking for the governmental bodies. In spite of their strong desire to positively answer the government's call and move to Yerevan, the writers found themselves in a difficult position where they had to make a choice between their existing place of residence, where life was progressing somewhat normally, and move to Yerevan, where the things were not as stable yet. From a political perspective, while our government officials were trying to keep the homeland safe from external and internal enemies and overcome untold other obstacles, it is worthwhile to mention that they were extremely cognizant of the importance of culture, literature, and science and the role they play in the life of the state. It seemed that they understood that although armies and winning wars are important, but without advancements in culture, literature, and science, the state could not live long.
Որ պետականությունը չի կարող իսկապես երկար կյանք ունենալ, բարեբախտաբար
Fortunately, there were those who recognized the value of spiritual life and literature and how urgent it was, especially in those days, for our intellectuals to be active and take part in socio-political life of the country and, in general, the establishment of a cultural environment. Although during the entire 1918 there was no real status change in this area, yet that period is considered as a preparative period for the upcoming 1919. It can even be said, without exaggeration, that the literary life was already showing signs of blossoming in that period. The representatives of the senior generation who were living and creating in Armenia would have a major role in this. When we speak of the senior representatives, we first and foremost remember Levon Shant, Hovannes Hovannesyan, Vartnes Papazian, and Minister Nigol Aghabalyan. They were at the forefront of initiatives for change and efforts to assemble the talent of the time, who in the future would become the period's cultural and literary nucleus.
Այս առումով երևի թե առաջին հանրապետության ամենալուսավոր կետը բնականաբար Նիկոլ Աղբալյանն։
In this regard, perhaps the brightest fact of the First Republic was Nikol Aghbalyan, a man whose ministerial mission is closely related to everything good that happened in the fields of science, culture, and literature. The establishment of the state university alone during those difficult times is worthy of highest praise. As a literary critic, Aghbalyan was interested in seeing the literary talent congregated in Yerevan and serve as the engine to push the country forward.
During those years, the Armenian authorities called on the intellectuals to come home from all corners of the globe to take part in rebuilding of their country. Those who would come would see that the environment was ready for them to work and create, thanks to all those who already were in Yerevan at that time, whose contribution and service were immeasurable in creating the environment where the newcomers would create. They were the ones who set up the field where the seeds would germinate, grow, and bear fruit. It was hard to cultivate the field. The ground was rocky and not everything succeeded at first, and many things failed. But when we look at the final results, we look back at the 1920s and see how the intellectuals and many great people began to move in. We are obliged to recognize that the foundation for this effort was indeed set during 1918 to 1920.
One of the most important steps for the formation of literary life in Armenia was the creation of a literary association. The association's meetings were held in the Armenian Parliament Hall. Though the association managed to organize just a few events, what it accomplished was extremely important and had its impact on the literary life of Armenia. Starting in May of 1919, literary lecture series were organized that featured prominent writers and literary experts.
These events attracted so many attendants that sometimes a change of venue was warranted to accommodate everyone. It is said that Levon Shant, despite his busy schedule, never missed an event and at times presented his own lectures. And when it happened that the lecturer was a young, novice writer, that the writer would definitely hear Shant's critique, positive or negative, at the end of their lecture presentation. The time was now ripe to assemble the scattered history literary talent that were around and creating but not part of the general literary environment. Following the founding of the Literary Association, and according to the testimony of contemporaries, Aghabalyan and Shant proposed creation of the Young Writers Union and establishment of what was generally called literary salon or literary club, a place where people would come together to discuss creative work a new direction, and exchange views. In a nutshell, a place from which intellectuals' learned opinions would filter out to the public.
The Literary Salon Club was holding its meetings in a small room designated by Nigol Akhbalyan. Since the place of the meeting was a former tavern, the Literary Salon Group began to be known as the Literary Tavern. Heated opinion exchanges and sometimes even political debates would go on in the tavern. Many of the members of the Literary Salon would go on forming the literary core of Armenia later in the Soviet era. In addition to the young writers, more established authors such as Armenian Dikranyan, her husband and Armenia's prosecutor Vartkez Aharonyan, Member of Parliament Mrs. Berjui, also began to participate in the deliberations of the Literary Salon. It was during those meetings that Yegishe Charents, the young poet, would establish his first contacts with the writers and literary environment. This was a crucial literary developmental time for Charents.
Yegishe Charents, one of the greatest Armenian poets of all time, was proclaimed as a poet during those years. We will have more to say about Charents later in this brief. For now, let's not miss the opportunity to talk about another important item. Who were the more or less well-known writers in Armenia during the period of 1918 through 1920?
Some of the more established writers of that era, such as Levon Shant or Avedis Aharonyan, were mainly engulfed in state-building work and could not be actively engaged in literature creation. Their literary reflections to this era came later when they were already living in the diaspora. But in this period, there were wonderful, albeit small number of writers and poets who created their literary works in the homeland and whose names we are obligated to save from obsolescence.
Karnik Kalasyan was among those brilliant yet forgotten names of that era. In addition to being a good poet, he was an honored citizen of the country and a great member of parliament. Born in Vagar-Shapat, he lived for only 36 years, and when he died after the establishment of the Soviet order, nobody even remembered him.
Kalasyan had been ill for a long time, but his last years were particularly harsh. Even in his difficult health conditions, he was fully devoted to culture and to his country. He kept himself occupied with worthwhile things. He was a soldier, a public figure, and a writer who was also ready to participate in politics if necessary. Once he was arrested and spent some time in a Moscow jail. That's how active he was as a person. Kalasyan's name was associated with the initiative to create a memorial day for the victims of the genocide, given the fact that the first commemoration ceremony of the victims of the genocide had taken place in Echmiadzin on the initiative of Vartkez Papazian and Kalasyan. Therefore, following the initial commemoration, the two appealed to the Armenian government in asking to recognize April 24th as a Remembrance Day.
Karnik Kalasyan, a poet from Echmiadzin and a member of Tashnaksuchun Party, published a very inspirational selection of quatrains. Let's see what he had to say in those difficult times. Blessed are you who will arrive happier than us, merrier than us. We were aliens in our own house, enter our home as true masters.
Երկիրն են իր հում վեհ ու անխռով, հավերժության մեջ ծովն է երազում, հոգիս արփած է նորից քո բույրով, նորից քո անմահ երգն եմ ես լսում։ Երազող երկրի վեհապանց գրկում, հավերժությունն է անվերջ տրոփում, իմ կարոտ սրտի խորունկ ծալքերում, սիրո հմայքի շուշաններ փթթում։
Armenui Tigranyan.
Armenui Tigranyan. This poetess was a symbol of inspiration for Armenian prominent poets of the time, as well as a symbol of feminine charm, love, and greatness. Born in Alexandropol, she was a sister of famous composers Armen and Nikolaos Tigranyan. Her husband Vartkez Aharonyan was the son of Avedis Aharonyan. In addition to family and friends, her heart and soul were with her compatriots and the homeland.
եւ պաշտոններ զբաղեցնում արտաքին գործերի նախարարությունում, հետագայում պաշտոն զբաղեցրեց
She served at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and later began working at the Ministry of Enlightenment, where she participated in daily procedural activities of the ministry. From newspaper accounts of the time, we see that she's everywhere where she was needed. When a march is organized in the city, we definitely see Armenian Tigranyan's name in the list of organizers. She was accomplishing a very important mission of uniting the women and helping them participate in the country's social life at a time when getting women out of their homes was a very difficult task given the social and political environment of 1918.
There are numerous accounts, reports, and documents on the activities of the Armenian writers and intellectuals during the years of the First Republic. There are numerous testimonies about special tours to military units and female writers taking care of the wounded in hospitals. The Armenian writers were also soldiers and civil servants. If necessary, and in the absence of educators, almost everyone was engaged in teaching. Yelishe Charench, for example, taught in Bashkateklar village of Gars during the 1918 to 1919 period, accepting in return only bread and eggs from the villagers.
Bartkes Aharonyan was a lecturer, a lawyer, and wrote poetry using Menag as his literary pseudonym. While he was used to write and publish his works, his real occupation was quite different. He would leave his job responsibilities on a short notice, run to the war front, and send letters back describing what was happening at the front line. In other words, he would perform ordinary journalistic work to keep the public abreast of the circumstances of the soldiers and their needs, and to motivate the people to donate in any which they could, including participation in volunteering detachments.
In the period during 1918 to 1920, Armenia was in a dire social and economic condition, and the primary task was to save the population from starvation and death. Nonetheless, the newly independent state, the homeland of all Armenians, the country of inspiration and dream of the Armenian writers, had to coax its educated children. For example, the Armenian government, at the request of Homanes Tumanyan, allocated money from its limited and meager budget to Armenian writers in Tbilisi who were in difficult financial conditions.
There are documents in the archives of the Ministry of Enlightenment that speak of granted royalties to a writer for works that was yet to be printed and published, but the ministry had already paid for it. This was done to help the writer maintain their absolute minimum financial stability and to continue writing and creating literacy works.
Thus, in these difficult conditions for the country, along with state building, an attempt was made to develop and shape the educational, spiritual, and cultural life of the fatherland. To do so, the Armenian intellectual, who fervently believed in a strong motherland and never lost hope for a brighter future, was kept at the center of the state's attention.
Ու պոետներ, որ չեն պղծել իրենց շուրթերն անեծքով, պիտի երգեն քո նոր կյանքը նոր երգերով, նոր խոսքով, իմ նոր հայրենիք, հզոր հայրենիք.
Speaking of literature and literary environment during 1918 through 1920, we must pay attention to one more important issue. How did literature of the time spread, and how did the literary environment affect the people? After all, advanced information exchange technologies, as we know them today, were not available at the time. We should immediately mention that the main means of dissemination of literature of the era continued to be the print media and the verbal word.
Due to a lack of resources, in the 2.5 years of the existence of the First Republic of Armenia, 1,007 books in total had been published. A small number of that total was dedicated to literature. The bulk of the publications were official governmental decrees, statements, and documents.
The print press was at a different level and was quite active during 1918 to 1920. Zank was one of the most popular newspapers of the time, along with Vantos, which was at first printed in Van, then moved to Tiflis, and during the days of the First Republic, moved to Yerevan. The newspapers not only focused on public and political issues, but also ran a wide range of literary materials. In some issues of Vantos, for example, there were more literary material than news on various social and political activities. Let me also state that on a purely ideological front, the press was very free in the First Republic. Socialist, Bolshevik, and even communist press was very active in spite of it running damaging propaganda against the independent republic. These newspapers, along with others, were also publishing literary works along with political and ideological opinion pieces. With all its good and bad, this was the press. In general, that was formulating and impacting the environment and providing the medium to publish and discuss literary works.
For the sake of presenting a somewhat complete picture of the literary life of the times, we must also mention the Armenian Cooperative, a monthly publication edited by Tavit Anan. Titled as the Armenian Cooperative, but there were quite a few pages allocated to the writers of the time, including Charents and their literary works.
Let's not forget that before the independence, there were no newspapers in Yerevan dedicated to literature where the authors could publish their works. The first of those were established right after the First Republic was born. One of the important novelties in the media of that time was the inclusion of reflections about cultural life on their pages. For example, the reader would see, side by side, daily news about the city and its mayor, and cultural and literary works. This was an indication that the country was putting as much of an emphasis on cultural as social or political views. In this sense, Zhalmanak and Harach newspapers were very active. There were weekly and monthly literary supplements and literary inserts that included literary works by different authors.
Երիտասարդ տաղանդների հայտնաբերման տպագրման առումով նույնպես արվում էր շատ կարևոր գործ, որը էլի
Publishing works by young and upcoming talents was among the important accomplishments. Nikol Akhbalyan was sending personal messages to the editors, pleading with them to publish the works of novice writers, most of whom were orphans of the genocide, to encourage them to keep on writing and creating. It was very important that during this period, writers like Kurken Mahari, Nari Zarian entered the field of literature. They are among some of the bright personalities of the era, when in spite of the circumstances, several writers entered the field of literature and later played an important role in the literature of Soviet times.
որոնք հետագայում պետք է շատ կարևոր դերակատարություն ունենային արդեն խորհրդային գրականության մեջ.
In terms of spreading literature, teachers also performed important work conveying to their students their experiences of recent literary events and impressions from lectures. During this time, literary groups and journals were formed even in schools and orphanages.
Այսպես կաթիլ Քայլ առ քայլ ձևավորվում էր գրական
This is how, little by little and step by step, a literary environment and the educational and cultural life was formed. Most importantly, enthusiasm and devotion had engulfed most people. One of the most important things in Armenia's cultural life during those years was the founding of the National Library of Armenia at the center of Yerevan, an endeavor that most Armenian writers participated in with great enthusiasm. Documents attesting to generous donations from Armenian Tigranyan and Yerishe Charens to the National Library of Armenia are well preserved. It is interesting to note that Charens had hired 2 porters to carry his books, which leads us to believe that his donation was quite large. Mentioning Charens, it should be noted that the most prominent event in the literary life of the First Republic of Armenia was perhaps his proclamation as a poet, which took place on October 18, 1919, at one of the literary events when Nigol Akhbalyan announced his name. Charens was not present at the event. He was away teaching in Pashkatsklalar in Kars. But how was the great poet discovered by the famous Armenian literary critic?
Ինչպես էր այս մեծ պոետին բացահայտել հայ նշանավոր գրաքննադատը
Akhbalyan recalls, I was waiting to be taken to a gathering where I was scheduled to speak. I was bored. Few small books and newsletters in Russian and Armenian were laid in front of me. The first thing I noticed was a thin booklet titled 3 Songs to a Sad-Faced Girl by Yerishe Charens. The second was a small booklet from the same author titled Dante's Myth. The titles were noteworthy and revealed a new person, a new character, a new attitude, and what seemed to be timeliness literary works by a talented novice following the footsteps of Vahan Derian. I decided to write about the author and his books the first opportunity I had. The opportunity would come almost 2 years later because, as Akhbalyan mentions, times were not favorable neither for writing nor for speaking. Those were times of terror and death. 2 years later, and on a beautiful day in 1919, Nigol Akhbalyan, the newly appointed Minister of Enlightenment and Art of the Republic of Armenia, delivered a lecture in the Parliament building entitled A New Poet. That poet was Yerishe Charens. From that day forward, the name of the great poet would become known to all.
Nigol Akhbalyan honored and decreed Charens, who in his The Grand Poem wrote, and Nigol Akhbalyan shook the lecture hall and the hallway one day, proclaiming you a great poet. Later, during the Soviet era, Nigol Akhbalyan's name was stricken out and Charens' lines recomposed to read, and a serious critic shook the lecture hall and the hallway one day, proclaiming you a great poet. The time has finally come to reinstate the truth.
Beginning in January 1st, 1920, Charens was already an employee of the Ministry of Enlightenment as an advisor for special missions. For many years, the impression was that Charens was given this opportunity simply to afford him the time to create literary works. Fortunately, new archival documents point to the fact that Charens was extremely busy at the ministry. There were about 300 to 400 documents testifying to the fact that Charens successfully fulfilled his duties at the ministry by complying and responding to requests from the minister or ministry employees.
Soon, the Sovietization of Armenia would come. With many prominent men, Nigol Akhbalyan was also placed in Yerevan's prison, from which he was freed during the February Revolt of 1921 and became an exiled foreigner. He could no longer meet Charens, but he never ceased to follow the poet's pen. He saw a great future for his talent. The period during 1922 to 1924 is considered as the ideologically left-leaning period of Charents's creative life. He was one of the pioneers of a new literary movement and one of the authors of what became known as Yereki Deklaratsia, Trio's Declaration. In this period, Charents denied such great names as Tumanyan, Isahakyan, and Deryan. He, in general, rejected all that he had believed in and praised earlier.
Tashnaktsagan Nikol Akhbalyan, who was exiled from the homeland, continued to be an authority for poet Yerisha Charents, who was taken by Bolshevism. It is not clear if gratefulness was the motivation or Charents actually wanted to hear Akhbalyan's opinion on the development of Armenian literature based on the new principles he, Charents, proclaimed in the Trio's Declaration. Perhaps both. In 1923, when Nikol Akhbalyan was still in Tabriz, Charents sent him his new literary creations. Two of these writings were published in separate booklets, Poezov Zurna and Romance on Ser, or Romance Without Love. On the latter, Charents annotated the following: "To my dear teacher Nikol Akhbalyan, whom I will never forget and will never stop respecting."
Reading these works, Nikol Akhbalyan was unable to restrain his anger because, in his own words, these works had impertinent content and showed a much decline in spirit. Answering back, Akhbalyan wrote Charents a letter titled Poezov Gardzik, or Poetry Opinion. Akhbalyan's remarks were harsh, but it was also an appeal to the nation's genius, a request and a lesson he wanted the poet to learn.
Քեզ քո բուրը հավաքիր, ազնվական ես ծնվել, պարտքը տուրեմն իմացիր։ Վայ քեզ Չարենց, ափսոս հայ գրականության, ավելի ափսոս իմ հույսեր, որ արկայծում են սակայն։
Fortunately, Akhbalyan's hopes and expectations did not go unnoticed. Charents would later become the beloved, patriotic poet of his nation, who would once again praise Naregatsi and Kuchak, Sayatnova and Deryan. Charents corrected his behavior and creative spirit, writes Akhbalyan. Segments of his Epigagan Lusapats, or Epical Dawn, show an effort to befriend the spirits.
There is a poem in that same book called To Beloved A, which is probably directed to Nikol Akhbalyan. At least, that's what Akhbalyan himself thought to be.
Ես չեմ մոռացել քեզ, բարեկամ, եւ հիշում եմ քեզ կրկին, ինչպես անցորդը թափառական հիշում է միշտ անցած օղին։ Սիրով է հիշում նա օղին հին, գուցե թախիցով, սակայն երբեք նա չի ցանկանա կրկին թողնել հեռուներն ու դառնալ հետ։ Երբ անցած ուղին հուշով անշեջ խոցում է ինչպես կարոտին հետ, բեղտում է նա այդ կարոտն իր մեջ, որ երբեք չդառնա ետ։
Thus, as he sums up Charents's character, who has now freed himself of the deceitful lies and spell of Bolshevism and its rosy but empty promises, Akhbalyan gives the best description of the poet yet.
Նա մրկահավը եղավ աշխարհասասան հեղափոխության, որ թռած էր Հայաստան երկրից, մասնակցելու խելագարված ամբոխների գրոհին։ Երբ ալիքն իջավ, մրիկներին վարժված իր թևերը անփոթորիկ մնացին։ Սողացողները արծվին չհասան, իր ճախրը հիմա խանգարում էր շատերին։
However, while Charents constituted an obstacle to the snakes and the rulers of the day, he would create many songs and become one of the most brilliant and immortal stars of Armenian literature. Charents's vision and literary life became a turning point in 1924 when he was able to travel abroad to Europe with clear aims and objectives. Here in Europe, Charents met with Armenian Revolutionary Federation members Avedik Isahakyan and Vahan Navasartyan. These meetings and discussions were very important for both sides, and today it is evident that Charents's life and work were impacted by these meetings. In 1957, Vahan Navasartyan published a work on this subject entitled Charents, Life and Work, where Charents's hitherto unknown literary works were brought to light. It is worthwhile to also mention that literary opinions about the struggles of the First Republic's independent period came to light at later times through Charents's and other famous authors' writings.
I think that the experience of the First Republic years was very important for Charents and his literary creations. We simply observe the results much later. Based on my personal observations, they mostly seem to be reflected in the Kirk Janabari, which in my opinion is a textbook of state building which Charents had formulated from the experience of the First Republic. And if we examine the times from this point of view, it is also interesting to note the example of Avedis Aharonian and Levon Shant. Although they did not write much during 1918 and 1920, but after the tragic fall of the First Republic and their forced move to the diaspora, Shant wrote two of his best plays, Ocean Bale and The Princess of the Fallen Fortress, with thoughts of the lost republic in mind, and that experience contributed greatly to his literature.
For so long, many famous names and exceptional stories through which the image of the Armenian writer and the statesman devoted to the country is perfectly illustrated were unjustly forced out of our collective memory. It is time to get reintroduced to those memories, to shed light on the darkness of those times, and to do justice to the memory of those bright names and important stories. Together, we will accomplish this mission.
Ու պետք է քայլել ու քայլել համար, ապրելու հսկա տենչը բեռարած, քայլել անիմաստ մի կյանքի համար, մարել ու վառել աստղերը մարած, որ տիեզերքի զառանցանքը մար, չցնդի երբեք ու մնա երազ։